as you hear the kind of our last talk by Leyla Isik, who is a soon-to-be associate professor starting July 1st.
Right.
And she's going to talk about seeing social interactions. Oh, she's at Johns Hopkins, sorry.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you to Ilker and all the organizers. This has been such a great meeting, and I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to start with this video of my son, Rami, and his friend, Sylvia. And before I even press play, you can already recognize that there are kids outside. Maybe you see their baskets. But when I press play, a much richer story unfolds. So even though there's no sound, you can tell that they're communicating. You can tell they have a goal to open that egg. And they're helping each other with that goal. You might also notice the amount of effort that Rami's putting into this and use that to make inferences about his mental states, his desires, his motivations, et cetera. And you do this all from watching a very short video clip without sound. Now, over the last several decades, and decade or so in AI, there's been amazing progress in this first set of problems in scene and object recognition, which is generally considered to be like the core of high-level vision. And we're now at the point where we have AI algorithms, even our cell phones can do most of these tasks, right? In contrast, though, I think we still, as we've heard in the talks today, have a much poorer understanding of the rest of this. And it's really this second group of problems that my lab is focused on, how we recognize other people's goals, actions, and in particular, their social interactions. So how you perceive other people's social interactions, like recognizing this helping interaction between Rami and Sylvia. This is something you can even recognize from really stripped down visual displays. So even though these are just two shapes, a few shapes moving around a 2D grid world, you can similarly see that they have a physical goal and they're helping each other with that goal. These abilities are shared with many of our primate relatives. They develop very early in infancy. And they seem to be kind of a pretty core aspect of human cognition. And so we've been trying to understand how we as humans solve this pretty challenging recognition problem. And in service of that, how we can get computational models that do the same thing. And I just want to impress on you again how difficult this problem is, right? So across these two very different looking visual stimuli, you could recognize them both as the shared interaction of helping. And so a large portion of our lab's work focuses on cognitive neuroscience and what the neural architecture supporting this is. I'm mostly not going to talk about that today, so I'm going to give you just a one-slide summary to motivate the AI research I will tell you about. So we know that there are dedicated regions in the human superior temporal sulcus, both posterior and anterior, that seem to selectively process social interactions between each other. Interestingly, these are separate from the theory of mind network, the set of brain regions that process other people's mental states, beliefs, et cetera. And interestingly, they seem to be embedded in a visual hierarchy that projects from early visual cortex and motion-sensitive regions through regions that recognize bodies into these regions of the STS. And this is sometimes referred to as the lateral stream, and it's considered to be a third visual pathway in addition to the classic two ventral and dorsal pathways. And interestingly, in these regions, one of the aspects of social interactions that they seem to care most about is whether or not two people are communicating. This is even in videos without sound, suggesting that this ability to visually recognize communicative actions is a really key goal of this pathway. And so for us, this really raised the question, if something as abstract as whether or not two people are communicating is extracted along this visual hierarchy in the brain, how do hierarchical vision models that can replicate so many other aspects of human vision do at this task? I'm going to tell you about that today, that unfortunately most modern DNNs, even the most modern ones and some of the largest ones we have, still fail at this task. And I think it's because, in addition to many other things that they lack, two of the really core things they lack are relational structure and even just very simple information about the 3D geometry of bodies. And I'm going to tell you about work in our lab to try to address each of these shortcomings. So to start with a bit of a primer that probably most people are familiar with, vision is typically studied in static natural scenes like this. And we know from this research that, for example, when a human or a primate views images like this, the activity in their ventral stream, the portion of visual cortex responsible for recognizing scene and objects, seems to be very well approximated by deep neural networks, to start with convolutional neural networks that are optimized to solve these particular tasks like object or scene recognition. And so that was a huge revolution in the field, but in a lot of ways it also made sense because we know that these CNNs and their inductive biases are actually rooted in our knowledge of primate vision, right? But that story has been getting more complex. So it's not just CNNs, but also vision transformers that I think, at least on their surface, share way fewer similarities with the biology, also seem to be just as good at matching vision. And it gets even weirder. So a few people have shown this now, but I'm going to highlight the work by Emily McMahon, a former PhD student, and Colin Conwell, a former postdoc in our lab, where they looked at not just diverse vision models, but also language models that were evaluated by passing sentence captions of the scenes through them to extract the embeddings from the language model. And what they found is that if you look at high-level, the model's predictivity, so each dot is a different model, they vary in terms of architecture, training set, et cetera. Nevertheless, almost all of them can predict the brain responses in these ventral stream regions very well. But pretty surprisingly, language models embedded, evaluating the sentence captions do similarly well, even though people just watch these scenes. And this has sort of reignited very old debates in the field, for example, about the extent to which vision might be language aligned, or the extent to which learning language has shaped human vision. And so to understand this, in collaboration with Marge Livingstone, we showed these same natural images from the natural scenes data set to macaque monkeys who had their neural recordings in IT cortex recorded. And we found that overwhelmingly, the results look very similar. So whatever is causing the language model prediction in human visual cortex, it also seems to be causing significantly above responses in monkey IT as well. So whatever it is, and we can get back to that later if people want, it seems to not be due to language per se. But for the purposes of this talk, this was a bit of an interlude. What we really wanted to ask was if instead of static scenes, we're looking at even very short natural video clips like this, do we still have the same wealth and diversity of models that predict responses to the brain regions of the lateral stream that process these short dynamic social videos? And so this was work now led by Kathy Garcia, also with Emily and Colin. And they took this fMRI data that Emily had collected in our lab of people watching these short video clips, each with 2 people in them. And so Emily took these video clips from a computer vision data set, actually, from the Moments in Time data set, and recorded whole brain fMRI responses, but in particular showed these responses along the lateral stream that got more and more abstract as you recorded them. And so we took those videos and the fMRI as well as behavioral responses that Emily collected to these videos. And so that we could also test language models, we also collected a sentence caption from people online for each of the videos, and passed either the videos, individual frames of the videos, or the sentence captions through different image, video, and language models to see how well each of them could predict the responses in both the brain and behavior. So I'm just going to quickly highlight, show you the neural results. So I'm just going to show you one representative region in the ventral stream, the PPA, which is the parahippocampal place area. It's a known scene processing region. And here I'm going to group the models by whether they take in images, in which case we passed in each frame of the video or some subset of frames of the videos and averaged, video models, or the language models, which got the captions. We looked at the models in lots of different groupings, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. So what we found in the ventral stream, like others have shown, is that each dot, again, is a model. There's many more image models in the set than everything else, just because those are the most prevalent. So many vision models, both image and videos, predict the scene responses or the ventral stream responses really well, essentially at the level of the noise ceiling, which is shown in gray. Interestingly here, though, language models evaluated on the sentence captions do significantly worse. I think highlighting a key difference between static scenes in their captions and even very short video clips in their captions. But when we look at these lateral stream regions, I'm just showing you one region here, but we see this a very similar trend across all the regions of this pathway. All of the models do a pretty poor job, and none of them are anywhere close to the noise ceiling, suggesting that even though humans have very good, reliable responses to these videos, it's not being captured by these neural networks. We see something similar when we look at the behavior. So people rated various features of the videos on a Likert scale. For example, scene properties like whether it's a close-up or expansive scene. And all of the models can do this task, no problem. But if you look at social judgments, for example, like whether or not people are communicating, the models get quite a bit worse. Language models are a little better here, but I think this reason is kind of trivial. Sometimes the captions are two people on a bench talking, right? And I think, though, even more surprisingly, they even struggle with these kind of visual spatial features, like are the two people in the video facing each other or not? And I just want to return to the stimuli for a second, just to make this, I think, really clear, is that even though these are sampled from a computer vision data set, in some cases very similar to the training regimes of these models, most models still can't tell that this top video has two people nearby each other interacting and the bottom one does not. It doesn't really seem to matter what the architecture is, the training is. And I think most interesting and also relevant to this workshop is that as models get bigger, so as their number of tunable parameters increases, their match to humans does not. You can improve their performance by fine-tuning them on human similarity judgments, which I think is interesting. But I think overall, overwhelmingly, it's really kind of shocking how badly these models do at these tasks. And so we see that most modern deep neural networks really fail to capture human social interaction judgments. This is regardless of architecture, number of tunable parameters, the training objective. And larger and more modern models are not really getting better. And so what's missing? So one thing that we know is missing are, and that we heard about yesterday, are notions of notions of mental states and effort, right? So these are sometimes instantiated, these sort of mental models, in something like a generative inverse planning model that would, for example, work by sampling different hypotheses about what the agent's goals in the physical world might be, and then simulating what those would look like to try to make a judgment about whether this was a helping interaction. And importantly, both the sampling of hypotheses and the simulations are based on a generative model of the physical and social world. And so it's unsurprising, and I think it's a big shortcoming, that these models don't have that. And it's in pretty stark contrast, though, to this more visual or bottom-up approach, where you just take in information about the agents and try to extract end-to-end information to directly predict that they're helping each other. But we wanted to ask if the visual bottom-up models, because we think that there are aspects of this that humans are doing in this more bottom-up way, could be made to be more human-like. And in particular, this is work by Manasi Malik, who asked if we could add the right type of inductive biases to these models. And so to add a relational inductive bias in, what Manasi did was took the visual information I'm starting with these simple shape videos. For example, you could just think about features like whether agents are nearby each other, touching each other, facing each other. And you could use these visual features to make a graph so that you now organize the information not just as an ordered list, but structured in a way that takes into account this relational information. So just for example, I'm just going to briefly talk about this. So for example, for each edge in an input graph, you could take, like that one there, you can take the features for each of the agents and objects on either side of it and concatenate them. You do that for every pair of objects in your, for every edge in your input graph. And you just pass that through a simple linear layer that you zero pad and concatenate. And that's your input graph at each time step to the neural network model. And then the GNN itself, once it gets the graph in, does something very similar to an RNN and LSTM, for those who are familiar, where it takes in the graph at each new time step and incorporates that new graph information with the previous time steps until the video is over, and it finally makes a prediction about the social interaction, like whether it's helping or hindering. Okay. We called this model social GNN. It was based on other GNN architectures that were coming at the time, but had some important differences that I'm happy to talk about. And we compared it to a baseline model that has the exact same input information and roughly the same structure. But instead of the graph processing, it just takes the features for each agent. So, sorry, I didn't say what the features were. They're things like their position, velocity, angle, size. And so at each time step, you can put those into the RNN and make a prediction. And what we find, so these models are identical in terms of their input information. They're the same in terms of their backbone here. All that's really changing is this graph input. And this small tweak, I'm not going to show you the results, but this small tweak, this very simple inductive bias, drastically improves the match to humans. The next thing Monesi did was compare that to an inverse planning model that was released with this data set. And what we found is that actually both of these models did a really good job of predicting human behavior. So one question is perhaps this GNN is learning like a cached or amortized version of this inverse planning model, which would have been interesting, but I think not really it's not what we found. So what we found is that actually these two things, their representations at the end, if you do RSA on the outputs of the model, look very different from each other. And I think even more interestingly, they both capture unique variants in human behavior, suggesting that these are two different strategies humans use and can possibly trade off between when they're making these judgments. In more recent research, we've shown people these videos in collaboration with Sherry Liu and Tianmen Xu, and looked at how well these models predict brain responses. And what we find is that, again, both models explain unique variants across the social brain. There's a recent preprint on that. Another reason we're really excited about the GNN model is that it can work in natural videos. So just like how we were able to create visual graphs for these Hyder and Simmel style animations, you can do that for these short video clips. If you put bounding boxes around people and objects and have a DNN extract embeddings for each of those bounding boxes, those are your node features, and your edges can be made based on the gaze direction between people. So this pink woman in pink is looking at the man in blue, who's looking at the object in his hand, and they're both touching those objects, et cetera. And so in that same way, with that same RNN backbone, you can run the GNN model. And what we found is that if you train it on only a few hundred videos, it does a very good job of predicting whether or not people are interacting or not. It does much better than the RNN control or even a standard CNN that's trained on much, much more data. And so together, I think this shows how this pretty simple inductive bias can really improve the model's performance and match to humans, especially in this sort of this regime where we're maybe more data limited. Finally, our lab manager, Wen-Shou Chin, also in collaboration with Monesi, wanted to test it on these videos I told you about before, where we had this kind of large-scale benchmarking effort. So these are results I showed you in the first part of the talk, where most image and video models fail to tell whether or not people are facing or communicating. And with basically no additional tweaking, we can look at social GNN, and it outperforms the overwhelming majority of these very large vision models. And so again, I think this is really amazing. This is like a pretty teeny model with like a few dozen layers a few dozen units in each layer, trained on a few hundred videos, and nevertheless, it's doing better than like Video JEPA, the best video reasoning model, right? And so I think this shows how a very simple relational inductive bias can allow social GNN to recognize social interactions. It explains unique variance beyond what's captured by inverse planning models. And it outperforms most modern DNNs. And so I was very excited about this, but it still has some limitations, social GNN does. First of all, it relies on manual annotation. So everything I've told you about so far, putting the bounding boxes in gaze direction, a human went in and did that. Also, because it is a neural model, it's still a bit of a black box. It's a much smaller black box than some of the other black boxes, but we don't really know what's driving its performance. And so in follow-up work, we wanted to ask if we could explicitly add this information in a more transparent way. And by we, I mean Wen Shou, who really was the architect behind this whole project. OK, so he designed this really cool pipeline that combined a few different models from computer vision that do pose estimation in videos and also depth estimation so that we could get a 3D body joint for these kind of dense meshes in the videos. And then from there, we can also reduce that to a very simple set of features based on our ideas about what humans are using in these tasks. So for example, he can take that mesh and make a 3D skeleton, or even more simply, he can just get a vector for each person in the video, which is the position of the center of their head in 3D and the direction of which they're facing in 3D. So this is now like 2 6-dimensional vectors, right, that we can use to summarize how these people are looking at each other in the video. And we found that both the full set of features and this really reduced set outperforms most DNNs again. So here's the full set of 3D joints in black. Here's those even more simplified pose features. So again, this is like just a 12D vector that we run a regression on, and it does better than most of these vision models. Interestingly, the 3D aspect of this does seem to be important. So you can just take the 2D information, for example, which a lot of pose estimation algorithms do, and you do get a pretty big hit. It varies feature by feature, but especially for things like, are these people communicating, the 3D seems to be kind of uniquely important. You can also ask, so the DNNs sort of vary in their prediction of human judgments. And like I said, we don't really know. It wasn't like a training task made them more human-aligned, or the architecture did, or something like that. But it seems like if you track how much information they have about 3D pose, that does predict how well they predict human judgments. So here I'm going to show you each of those models, plotted the score to match humans on, so say, their judgment of communication, relative to how much information it has about 3D pose. And you see this really strong correlation where when the models get better at predicting 3D pose, they also get better at matching the human judgments. Again, this is true in 2D, but significantly less so, suggesting that this 3D pose information also helps DNNs do better at this task. Finally, we asked, what if you added this into the DNN? So you can take their huge embeddings that we were fitting earlier. So these are the results I've just been showing you. They do OK. But what if you just, again, append this 12-dimensional vector to them? Now, they do significantly better, both at the visuospatial judgments, like are these people facing, but even things like are they communicating, showing that just adding this very simple information could drastically improve how these vision models do. And so these very simple information about 3D body geometry can predict human social interaction judgments better than most deep neural networks. It predicts how well a deep neural network matches humans on many downstream social judgments. I only told you about 2 today. And it can be used to augment deep neural network embeddings to help us get better models of humans' performance on these tasks. Just zooming out for a second, I think the problem of perceiving social interactions is hugely important for human cognition and also for AI, especially as AI more and more has to interact with humans. But I think these principles about the importance of relational structure and this explicit 3D information is really important for other aspects of vision more generally, right? To understand that these eggs are in the basket, the kids are sitting on the grass, many of these physical concepts we were hearing about before, you need to have this relational information that most DNNs fail to grasp in end-to-end training. Similarly, the idea about pose features and explicit representations of pose relates to a lot of ideas about object skeletons and things like that, that again, I think we need to be thinking about and thinking about how to add kind of efficiently into different deep neural networks. So with that, I will thank my lab, especially the people who did the work I talked about today, and I am happy to take questions.